Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one there are several Russian advances all across the front line, from the northern section of the front line within the Kursk region to the southern section of the front line within the Zaporizhzhia region, where the Russians launched a push towards the town of Mala Tukmashka, entering the eastern outskirts of the town and storming it from the eastern and southern directions. The Russians also advanced west of Orikhiv in the direction of Bahadir, where they are developing offensive operations towards the town from the eastern, southern, and southeastern directions. The Russians also managed to advance east of Pokrovsk as they developed offensive operations towards the defensive line east of the city. The Russians continued developing offensive operations across the Zherebets and Oskil River lines, storming new towns in both of these areas. Starting out in the southern section of the front line, we see that the Russians have stormed the town of Mala Tukmashka from the southern and eastern directions. The Russians managed to gain a foothold within the eastern residential area of Mala Tukmashka and capturing several fortified positions and forest lines to the south and to the east of the town. This allowed them to gain a foothold within the town and start fighting within it. The Russians are here working to develop offensive operations towards the prison area and railway area within the central parts of the town, to which they will develop offensive operations further within it to reach the outskirts of Orikhiv from the eastern direction. This shows that the Russian offensive operations here in the Zaporizhzhia section of the front line is not limited to simply improving their positions ahead of the defensive line, but is instead targeted at Orikhiv, as a development through Mala Tukmashka will allow the Russians to deploy soldiers within the basements of the town and within several areas of where the fortified positions or otherwise, from where they can operate FPV drones and target the city itself, where they can hit the Ukrainian supply lines. It will also allow the Russians to pull up their artillery close enough towards the town to heavily bombard it. With support of FAB bombs, artillery, and FPV drones, the Russians can siege the city and move towards capturing it. Orikhiv had a pre-war population of about 13,000 people, but now only houses about 1,500, as its close proximity to the front line makes it difficult for anyone to live there. Most people there are either older people who refuse to leave their homes, someone who may be pro-Russian, or simply necessary workers who help keep the day going within the city. The Ukrainians have several areas, both high-rise apartment complex areas, farm areas, fortified positions, and much more where they can defend their positions within it. However, they do not have any significant industrial area, and the apartment complex area is fairly small. There is some smaller industrial areas here and there, mostly farm related. There's the train station in the central parts. This means that the city itself is not very defensible, but it's also difficult to push through without any place to centralize and concentrate your forces for a push through it, especially with concentration of Ukrainian fortified positions and FPV drone operators. Makes it difficult for the Russians to capture the town. However, we see that the Russians are starting offensive operations in this direction. That means that they are likely confident that they can succeed, which indicates that the Russians likely have a large concentration of forces. The Ukrainians also recently sent a lot of reinforcements to this area and anticipating an offensive operation by the Russians, and this shows that they had good insight as to the scale of the Russian operation, expecting the Russians to launch a larger one than first shown. I don't expect any quick significant developments in this section of the front line, as it is heavily fortified, but with the move into Mala Tukmashka, I don't believe that it will end anytime soon. Instead, I believe there will be further developments north of Robotyne, east of Orikhiv, and in the western flank, as Russians will look to expand their offensive operations from multiple directions to improve their odds of making any significant success in this area. Getting control over Orikhiv would significantly improve the logistical situation for the Russians. However, they would still be facing significant fortifications of the Ukrainians in every direction beyond it. This is a forward position of the Ukrainians and not their main defensive position. Instead, we have two lines of defense beyond it. This would be similar to the Robotyne direction, except it is much larger than Robotyne and much more significantly fortified than Robotyne. However, we see that the Russians, with a move through Mala Tukmashka, can use the residential area to avoid heavy casualties moving towards it. Based on this, we see that the Russians have potential to achieve some sort of success. However, it will be a long and difficult battle to reach Orikhiv, much less capture it and go beyond it. Moving on to the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians advance in the direction of Bahatir, gaining control over several forest lines here west of Rusliv, following the capture of the fortified position of the Ukrainians centered around the forest patch area. Here to the southwest of Rusliv, they managed to open up the road for the next defensive line, and now the Russians are facing off against the final defenses south of Bahatir, which is the fortified position shaped in an hourglass to the south of the town. The Russians are here continuing their offensive operations west of Konstantinopel and west of Rusliv to improve their positions to storm Bahatir directly from the eastern, southern, and southeastern directions. The Russians will likely also expand their offensive operations north of Andreevka to capture the remaining fortified positions and flank Oleksivka from the north. We have seen some fighting here north of Andreevka, but nothing decisive yet. The Russians are looking to capture Toretsk and Orikhiv, gaining control over the final towns along the border area before moving on to the defensive line here to the south. Moving further north to the east of Pokrovsk, the Russians have reached the outskirts of Myrolyubivka, where they are advancing northwest of Yelisavetivka following the capture of the town. With this, the Russians are moving on towards the rear of the defensive line here east of Pokrovsk. They're looking to gain control of it, which will significantly improve their positions along the main highway and allow them to advance along the river line towards the highway as well. This is to gain control over a wider area of the highway and to improve the logistical lines of the Russians for a push towards Mirnorod from the eastern direction and to advance further along the eastern flank of Pokrovsk now that the western flank has reached a stalemate with the constant Ukrainian counterattacks. Russians are making use of their numerical superiority despite their inability to concentrate large forces on the western flank due to the constant Ukrainian pressure. They are able to spread out their forces and attack multiple areas, and now they're looking to attack the eastern flank now that the Ukrainians are focusing their forces in the western flank. Further east, the Russians have managed to improve their positions in the Zherebets River line direction, where they're storming Nova directly, gaining a foothold within the town and attacking into the central parts. The town of Nova is separated into two parts, with the river line going through the center. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the eastern parts of the river line, connecting it with their forces along the road to the north, following which they'll likely bypass the river line from the northern and southern flanks to attack the rear and gain full control over the town, which will allow them to secure a wider area along the main road, advance towards Zelena Dolina and Lipove to the west, securing a buffer zone around the main road, which will allow them to advance further southwards towards Stavki and Liman, and northwards towards Kritkodo and Novyemir, where they would be developing further westwards and northwards as well. Moving on to the Oskil River line, the Russians advanced here to the north of Kindrashivka, where they're bypassing the town by attacking Malashevkivka. We see that Malashevkivka is separated into the eastern and western parts. The eastern part is a farm area with a few buildings, while the western part has more buildings and less farm area. The Ukrainians have a fortified position along the main road here west of Malashevkivka, and Russians gain control over the town and the fortified position will allow them to cut off one of the main supply roads towards Kupiansk from the north, further isolating the town here on the western bank of the Oskil River line. The Russians are likely aiming to reach the railway area where they would be fighting over Velika Shepkivka to improve their positions here on the northern flank, cut off further supply lines of the Ukrainians, improve their own supplies, and creating a buffer zone by the west of the highway, securing the supply road there, and also to make use of the railway area as cover for further offensive operations towards Kupiansk from the north. Therefore, the Russians are here developing the offensive operations further, following the Ukrainian counterattacks in the area. In the Kursk region, we see that the Russians have developed offensive operations further within Gorenal, gaining control over the entire northern parts of it and reaching the residential area in the central parts of the town. This is only a matter of time before the Russians gain full control of it, therefore the southern parts of the Ukrainian foothold within the Kursk region, and it would leave only Oleshnia left within Ukrainian control, and the Ukrainians have less than 0.5% of their peak control over the Kursk region remaining under their control, as the fighting over Oleshnia and Gorenal showcases the end of the fighting within the Kursk region. Finally, the Toretsk direction, there is this footage here taken by a drone, which shows the city. The drone is recording the entire city, showing the complete destruction we see within it, following the years of fighting around it and near it. At the same time, we also see the apartment complex areas shot by artillery, but we also see the significance of the waste heaps, both in the northern and southern parts of the city, completely overlooking it with the high ground. The apartment complex area in the central parts is also showcased as one that stands above the rest of the residential areas, and from this we can see why the Russian hold of the city is so strong. Despite the Ukrainians re-entering the city, they've been unable to gain a foothold within the apartment complex areas in the central parts or the industrial area, as the Russians have a buffer zone around it with the open fields and the high-rise buildings, allowing them to overview the situation nearby. Despite the Ukrainians having the waste heaps under their control in the northwestern outskirts of the city, it is only a matter of time before the Russians gain full control of it. And despite the complete destruction of the city, many apartment complex buildings are still standing, which will allow the Russians to concentrate forces and supplies within the city for further offensive operations. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.